But I want to bring Leon Panetta into this, the former Secretary of Defense. Secretary, thank you for taking the time. One of the things that keeps coming up is, and it goes along by and large party lines, but criticism about the way all of this was handled did seem to be a bipartisan theme, some going further back to say it's the fault of other administrations. But you did recently say, Secretary, that you thought this was Joe Biden's Bay of Pigs, his worst nightmare. Do you still feel that way in light of some of the follow-up incidents that have happened, some say provocative acts that might look random, like, you know, what's going on in North Korea, launching more missiles, China getting particularly bellicose of late? What do you think?
Well, Neil, I understand that this hearing is going to try to look at all of the issues involved with Afghanistan, both past and present. But my biggest concern, frankly, is that we need to look forward and ask ourselves, how do we protect our national security? And protecting our national security is, yes, it's about China, it's about Russia, it's about North Korea, it's about Iran, but it's also about terrorism. And the greatest concern I have is that the Taliban that is now in charge of Afghanistan is pretty much the same Taliban that was in charge of Afghanistan in 9/11. And that tells me that one of the dangers here is that Afghanistan could clearly become a safe haven for terrorists, for Al-Qaeda, for ISIS, for the Haqqani terrorists, and that could represent a real threat to our national security. So I'm more interested in trying to determine what steps does the United States have to take now to make sure that we can protect our national security in the future.
Well, we can't protect it in Afghanistan, right? So if these groups are allowed to do whatever they want with Taliban protection, whatever differences they have amongst themselves, like ISIS-K and certainly the Taliban, if you're right, and I think you've signaled this in the past, we might have to return to Afghanistan.
Well, you know, the issue for this president and for our country is to do what's necessary to protect our national security. We've just been through a 9/11 20th anniversary where we saw what Al-Qaeda was willing to do in attacking our country and killing almost 3,000 people. We went to war to try to make sure that Al-Qaeda would never get the chance to attack our country again, and that hopefully Afghanistan would not become a safe haven for terrorism. Well, the danger right now is that this Afghanistan under Taliban control, I think will become a safe haven for terrorism. And that means that Al-Qaeda is going to be free to reorganize itself and to expand its work and to continue to plan attacks. That's what Al-Qaeda does. They're interested in attacking the United States of America. That's always been their goal, and killing Americans, as well as killing others. And that's true for ISIS, and it's true, frankly, for the Haqqanis. Their interest is in killing people. And so what we need to have is intelligence on the ground. We need to make sure that we have strong intelligence capabilities, yes, in a Taliban Afghanistan. Intelligence is smart enough to know how to do that. We have ways and technologies to be able to gather that kind of intelligence. We do need people on the ground so that we are monitoring just exactly what Al-Qaeda is doing and what other terrorists are doing. And secondly, we need to have the capability to use counterterrorism operations against those targets. The president himself has said we've got to use counterterrorism. It's called over the horizon. But regardless of what you call it, we need to have special forces capabilities that can move if we identify terrorist targets who are threatening the United States of America. That is important in order to protect our security.
Secretary, you always hear the big difference between the Taliban now and then is the Taliban was working with, or at least countenancing, everything that al-Qaeda was doing 20 years ago. Not so much today, particularly when it comes to this fringe group, this ISIS-K group. So we have less to worry about. Do you buy that?
No, I don't. I heard a spokesman for the Taliban being interviewed by a national network, in which the interviewer asked the Taliban spokesman about bin Laden's role in the attack on 9/11. And the response was that that individual saw no evidence that bin Laden was involved in the 9/11 attack. If that's what that individual believes, and that represents the leadership's view in Afghanistan of the role of al-Qaeda, what it tells me is that they are going to allow al-Qaeda to do whatever the hell they want. And that's dangerous.
Now, you talk about you can get people on the ground who necessarily aren't troops that could be monitoring how things are going, but it's a lot tougher without troops in this environment right now, isn't it?
Oh, there's no question. It's tougher when the Taliban are in full control of Afghanistan. To be able to have good intelligence, it's a big country. It was tough enough to do it when we were involved in working with the Afghan government to be able to cover that country and determine where the threats were coming from. Now it's even more difficult with the Taliban in charge. In addition to that, to do counterterrorism operations, I mean, if we have to do them from bases outside of Afghanistan, whether it's a carrier, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Uzbekistan, wherever, it's going to take more time to be able to go after those targets. And that's going to make it much more difficult to be able to hit the targets that could represent a threat to our security. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here in order to protect our national security. We have that obligation. As I said, This is not something we can ignore. Yeah, sure, it's the end of a chapter in Afghanistan. We understand that. But it's not the end of the war on terrorism. And that means that the United States is going to have to continue to be vigilant about the potential threat that we are going to be vulnerable to from what is now a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan.
Secretary, do you think these 100 or so Americans, and no exact number given yet again by the Secretary of State, are going to get out of Afghanistan safely?
Well, look, I think the administration has several important responsibilities here as we look forward. Number one, they have a responsibility to get all of U.S. personnel out of Afghanistan. Whether it's 100 or 150, whatever the number is, we have a responsibility to them to do everything necessary to get them out. And the same thing is true for the Afghans who fought alongside of us.
But do you think they will get out? I guess do you think they will get out, Secretary?
Well, we have a responsibility to do whatever the hell is necessary to get them out. Now, that means we've got to be able to track them. That means we have to be able to guide them. That means that we have to be able to find ways to be able to get them out of Afghanistan, whether they go to Pakistan, whether they go to a particular location where we can try to retrieve them. We have a responsibility to get them out. We can't just turn our backs on them, and we can't just allow the Taliban to tell us that they're going to cooperate when in fact they're not cooperating. So we got to push through this. That's number one. Number two, as I said, I think we have really got to develop our intelligence capabilities and our counterterrorism capabilities. Three, we've got to continue to put pressure on this Taliban, working with our allies to make sure that You know, if they say they're not going to support terrorism, if they say they're going to provide women's rights, then let's see them, in fact, implement that, not just use words, but in fact do that. And then lastly, I think we've got to learn the lessons of what's happened here in Afghanistan. If we're going to deploy United States forces anyplace, we need to have a clear mission. We need to have a strategy for achieving that mission, and we need to have an exit strategy. That's a lesson we should have learned from Vietnam, and it's a lesson that we now should learn from Afghanistan.
Secretary, we're learning a little bit now that, defense officials and higher ups and those confidants of the administration were warning the president that what could ensue with our pullout. And, he took it and, weighed it and obviously went through with the withdrawal. Are you concerned about his judgment after all of this?
Well, Joe Biden has a lot of experience. He knows foreign policy. He's known it for a long time. He knows, that the adversaries that face our country and what needs to be done to deal with our adversaries. Look, presidents make mistakes just like anybody else. I think the most important thing for this president to do is to be willing to accept responsibility for the mistakes and to move on and to basically do what is necessary now to protect our national security. He made the decision. Some will support that decision. Some will oppose the decision. But in the end, I think the important thing for the United States of America and for this president is what are we going to do to make sure that America never again experiences another 9/11 attack.
Secretary, you say that President Biden knows foreign policy, but on a lot of key issues over the years, he has not exhibited that knowledge, and some have criticized him for being on the wrong side of almost every important foreign policy initiative. He was against the taking out of Osama bin Laden. When you were leading the charge to take out Osama bin Laden, his concern at the time was about collateral damage. Obviously, the effort to take him out succeeded, but it was a reminder that on these key areas, maybe the president isn't as steeped or well-schooled in this or accurate in this or expert in this as he likes to say.
No, Neil, look, I've known Joe Biden for a long time. And one thing he's always done is he has raised questions about the decisions that impact on foreign policy. And that's okay. That's okay. That's what senators are responsible for doing, is to ask questions. And very frankly, as vice president, he asked the same questions. I don't have a problem with that. I think that it's important when a president has to make decisions to have people in the room that are saying and raising questions about whether or not these are the right steps to take. I think that's important to do. And frankly, I think every president, including this president, needs to have people in the room that are saying, wait a minute, I don't think this is the right decision. There are problems here. There are consequences that you have to look at. That's important to do. So I don't question Joe Biden's knowledge or his capability or his willingness to ask questions. I think that's a good thing to have. I think more questions should have been asked with regards to Afghanistan as to what the potential consequences would be so that we could take steps to deal with that. For some reason, that didn't happen. But now the issue is we have a situation in Afghanistan that represents a national security threat. We damn well better do what we have to do to protect our security.
Secretary, Donald Trump has said this would not have happened if he were president. Do you believe that?
No, I don't. As a matter of fact. I think it was Donald Trump's decision to get out of Afghanistan. He's the one who, at Doha, basically cut the agreement to do it. I think the Taliban, very frankly, got the best of us at Doha. They got everything they wanted, and we got very little in return. And I think he would have gotten us out of Afghanistan, as quickly as he could, and probably made some of the same mistakes. So, look, in some ways, I guess I don't question the fact that the president made the decision that it was time to take our forces out of Afghanistan. I think the question comes down to execution, and were the right questions asked in terms of were we going to effectively execute that decision in a way that would accomplish his decision, and yet do it in a way that would also protect our people and the Afghans who fought with us. That's the question that I think hopefully Congress will continue to ask, and one that we need to know the answers to in order to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes in the future.
Do you think Antony Blinken should resign?
No, I'm a believer that the president decides who stays and who goes in an administration. And if the president has confidence in Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, then I think he should stay. But that's a decision, frankly, between the president and the Secretary of State.
Finally, when you mentioned the Bay of Pigs thing, referring to the incident with a young U.S. President JFK just a few months into office, leading this debacle that failed, it did trigger a number of tests and challenges to the new president around the world. Some say the biggest, of course, was the setup for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you think that some of the things that have occurred since the collapse of Afghanistan, including now North Korea launching still more long-range cruise missiles, China getting very provocative, recommending that it send ships to our seas as we send ships to their seas, even though they're not their seas, but you get my point that these things are not happening in a vacuum. They're happening post this collapse. And it is because of that they're getting increasingly provocative and in our face.
Well, Neil, look, I think the United States is confronting a dangerous world. And it's been dangerous for a while because I think our adversaries have read weakness on the part of the United States. I think that's why Russia has been more aggressive in the way they've handled themselves and come after us. I think China reads weakness, and so they're being much more aggressive. And I think that's true for other adversaries. We've got a dangerous world. We've got to confront not just China and Russia. We've got to confront Iran. We've got to confront North Korea and the testing that they're doing. We've got to confront terrorism. We've got to confront cyber attacks, which are, without question, the battlefield of the future. So there is a lot that we have to worry about as a country in terms of protecting our national security. Anytime something happens that sends a message out to our adversaries that somehow the United States doesn't have its act together, clearly that creates a certain vacuum. It is very important for the president, for this administration, to make very clear that the United States is going to be a world leader in terms of dealing with national security, that we are going to work with our allies in trying to protect our national security and try to advance peace in the world. And it is very important for the United States to make clear that when we give our word about what we're going to do, that we stick to it. So I think without question, the United States now has to make clear that we have a strong, steady foreign policy, a strong, steady national security policy, and that we have a clear vision about what is going to be necessary in order to tell our adversaries, wherever they are, that the United States is strong and will stand up to protect the United States of America. That is a message that now has to go out to the world.
Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, Chief of Staff, so many important positions in the history of this country. Thank you for taking the time, Leon.
You bet. Good to talk to you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.